Good morning and welcome to the program. Today's program I call Wave the Stick Until the Music Stops. During this program I'll be talking about the art of conducting, a topic which is so vast I've decided to divide it into two parts, and we'll do part one today and part two in December. But today we're going to be talking about the what part. What is the job of a conductor? What does the conductor do? And for part two, we'll talk about the how. But if you have any questions at any time, you can call. You can either call me. My phone number is on the internet, on the Willow Valley directory, or you can email me, and I'll respond to emails very quickly. davidsgierch@hotmail.com, and I'll post that email address again on the last slide this morning, in case you don't get it now. So, to get things going, here's a little bit of Beethoven, and I'd like you to especially keep your eyes on the conductor and see if you can follow what she is doing. Here we go. So this is an orchestra and this is a conductor. Just so we have our terms straight, we're not talking about materials that conduct electricity like silver or copper, but we're talking about people who conduct orchestras, just as, well, you just saw one, but maybe the name Leonard Bernstein you might know, conducting, say, the Vienna Philharmonic. That's our topic today. But you could also have a conductor in front of a band, a wind ensemble. For example, this group playing a little bit of Shostakovich. So we could be talking about a conductor in front of an orchestra or a band, but it could also be another conductor working with a choir, as in this video clip. So a conductor may be standing in front of an orchestra or a choir, a band, could be a jazz band, a theater orchestra, could be the Mormon Tabernacle Choir with a cast of hundreds, or it could be a more intimate chamber group of maybe 10. They're all conductors. And, or what about those people who just like to conduct along with a recording, like this little fellow? So do you think that perhaps his parents have a career plan in mind for him, a career path? Well, Leonard Bernstein has nothing on this kid, but is he really a conductor? Is this little boy really a conductor? Maybe someday, but not yet, although he does have some pretty impressive moves. So what is a conductor? What is the job of a conductor? Today we're going to be talking about the what part. What is the job of the conductor? And then in December, as I said, we'll do part two. How does the conductor do what a conductor does? Well, let's begin with the training aspect. This is the usual. Of course, there are lots of variations, but as a child, the conductor probably has some musical training going on. Let's take a look at, for example, Leonard Bernstein. He did have lessons at an early age. The unusual thing with Bernstein was that he was not born into a musical family. In fact, his father was very much opposed to his pursuing a career in music or even an interest in music. But one day his sister, his aunt rather, his father's sister, dropped a piano off at the house, and Leonard was hooked from that point on. So he got some lessons at a very early age. He did go on to college. He went to Harvard University, studying music there. In terms of competitions, which is again the usual route that is taken by musicians, competitions for conductors in this case, Bernstein didn't really participate in any competitions, but he did win a prize that we'll talk about later that kind of beats all the competitions. So then he continued with further instruction. After Harvard, he went on to the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia, one of the top schools in the world for music. I studied there for a while, all along the way picking up small-time jobs as a conductor, choral conducting and instrumental conducting, eventually working his way up to the New York Philharmonic, where he was assigned as the assistant conductor. Now what that means, to be an assistant conductor, means that it's his job to prepare all the scores in case the main conductor is absent or for some reason can't fulfill the conducting responsibilities. And that's exactly what happened, but it wasn't the main conductor. It was actually a guest conductor by the name of Bruno Walter, was scheduled to conduct the New York Philharmonic one evening and called in sick, couldn't do it. And so Bernstein took over, but on 0 rehearsal time. Can you imagine that? Conducting a major orchestra, one of the greatest orchestras in the world, without ever rehearsing them on this particular concert. But it went so well, he was so successful, that in fact the next day, the New York Times had his picture on the front, or they had a story about him on the front page of the paper. He was an instant success, and his reputation just skyrocketed from that point on. And in fact, he would someday soon thereafter become the primary conductor of the New York Philharmonic. So there are some other paths, for example. Take this fellow, for example.
We'll begin our general questioning with Arlene Francis.
Mr. Ozawa, is that the correct pronunciation?
Yes.
Mr. Ozawa, is the service that you do, is it something that can be enjoyed by any of the members of the panel?
Yes.
Is it a service that has some entertaining aspects to it?
Yes.
Would you say, Mr. Ozawa, that you are a performer?
Yes.
Are you
And so on it goes. How many of you remember that show, What's My Line? Well, that's Sergei Ozawa when he was only 28 years old back in 1963. And at that time, he was also the assistant conductor for the New York Philharmonic, but his name was not well known. He was not a well-known figure. Had they done this program some years later, then certainly that panel, they would all know his name because he went on to become one of the most successful conductors of the 20th century. He was soon appointed conductor of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, a job that he held for 29 years, which is really unusual to be on one conducting job for 29 years. But again, one of the most successful of the century, although in 1963, relatively unknown. So let's look at Alan Gilbert. He's another conductor for the New York Philharmonic. Until very recently, he was the conductor for the New York Philharmonic. Here he is conducting a little bit of Rossini, a Rossini overture. And let's see if we can see what his responsibilities as a conductor might be. Now, as a comparison, look at this recording of an elementary school band. So there you have an elementary school band, and a moment before you heard Alan Gilbert conducting the New York Philharmonic. One, the very beginning of their time as musicians, their careers as musicians, and one, the culminating product, the New York Philharmonic. But believe it or not, as different as they are, these two conductors have very similar responsibilities. Let's take a look at what they might be. The responsibilities I've divided into two groups, musical and non-musical. Now, the musical responsibilities could include some of these: oral skills, music history, music theory. Certainly you have to be very knowledgeable in music theory, and of course conducting skills. Performance ability, that means conductors should be able to perform on an instrument or vocally or on piano, whatever, but performance ability is a must. And also a thorough knowledge of music history and style to make sure, for example, that you're conducting Beethoven as Beethoven is supposed to be conducted. And if you're working with instrumentalists or voices, you should know, of course, all those instruments, how they're played to their maximum potential. On the non-musical side, a conductor needs to be inspiring. A conductor needs to be disciplined. Now you might wonder, well, Alan Gilbert with the New York Philharmonic compared to an elementary school band, yes, they both need to be not only disciplined, but they have to be able to discipline their musicians. Public policy, interesting topic there. The conductor needs to know how what is the interaction between the community and the orchestra or band or choir. How do they interact? What do they expect of each other? Conductor should be a good administrator, being able to organize schedules and budgets and so on. Be able to communicate well. And communication, we're going to talk more about this in part 2, but communication is both verbal and nonverbal. Once a conductor stands up in front of a group in a performance, that conductor can't be talking to the musicians. It has to be, all the directions have to be nonverbal. And of course, you have to be a community leader. Now, the community leader is becoming especially important these days because of the pandemic. Most orchestras, as you may know, have canceled their 2021 season, going all the way back to March. All performances have been canceled. Theaters, orchestra performances, band performances, it's all canceled. So conductors and community leaders are working very hard to figure out how to keep the musicians not only active and busy as a group, but also frankly, to keep them employed. When you're paying an orchestra about $150,000 per person minimum, that would be the Philadelphia Orchestra, New York Philharmonic, Boston. Those musicians get about $130,000, $150,000 a year minimum. Well, what's happening lately is the orchestras are cutting deals with the unions, and they're actually cutting back 25, 30% on their salaries. So they're trying to create all these clever, creative ways to manage through this pandemic time. Also, we have the musical and the non-musical. There might also be some bonus characteristics in a conductor. A conductor might bring a lot of personal wealth. Like suppose, for example, a conductor is working with an orchestra with a very limited budget, or a band. Maybe that conductor brings a personal wealth to help the orchestra through. Maybe the conductor will bring connections. Well, this conductor may know a soloist that would be we could hire, or have access to a certain piece of music they would like to play. A conductor might be cheap. It might be a conductor beginning their career, so they won't expect a large salary. Also, maybe it'll be a great name, a famous name. Wouldn't you want to hire a conductor with the last name of Bernstein, for example? Great experience. I remember conducting a group in which it was an Erie Philharmonic Orchestra and choir, and we had to hire a new conductor, and we hired one with a considerable amount of experience. Turned out to be not a great fit, but we hired that person mostly because of the name and their experience. You might also want to hire a minority. All these thoughts have to go through your mind. Suppose you are part of a committee. Maybe you're on the board of trustees, and your job as a board member is to select the next conductor for your choir, your band, your orchestra. Maybe a minority. It could be a racial minority, a gender minority, whatever. So all these things play into the selection process for a conductor. Let's take a look at Walter Damrosch. Now, this recording goes way, way back. He was the conductor, again, of the New York Philharmonic back in the early part of the 20th century, 1902, 1903. But let's take a look at, first we'll listen to him play. Here is just a wonderful old vintage recording of Walter Damrosch playing the piano. Let's listen to that for a moment. Well, what does Walter Damrosch have, or what did he have? Well, did he have a lot of personal wealth? Well, not necessarily, but he had connections to wealth. One of his close friends was none other than Andrew Carnegie. And because of that connection, because of Carnegie's wealth, Walter Damrosch was one of the people that was influential in the creation and the building of the Carnegie Hall in New York City. Walter Damrosch was also the son of Leopold Damrosch, who had been conductor and founder of what was to become the New York Philharmonic. So he had that name recognition. And also, of course, he had tremendous experience. Growing up in a musical family, he had a lot of experience conducting choirs and opera orchestras and so on. So back in the early part of the century, Walter Damrosch fits this mold of wealth and connections and name and experience, these bonus features that we talked about when selecting a conductor. Not always the case, but in his case, and in many other conductors since Walter and before, we find these kinds of things. So let's again pretend that you are part of this committee, the selection committee. All right, you're going to hire, for example, suppose you're going to hire a conductor for an orchestra, and maybe this orchestra has about 100 members. That's a little bit on the high side. Orchestras usually have about 80, maybe 90 members, but to keep it simple, let's talk in terms of 100. Would you consider hiring a timpanist, a percussionist as the conductor? Well, you want someone who can relate to the orchestra. Well, how many timpani players do you have in an orchestra of 100? You only have one. Now, okay, some of you are saying, yeah, but what about the Berlioz symphonies, and what about Mahler and Stravinsky? And yes, you need multiple timpanists, perhaps. But generally speaking, to do the standard repertoire of Mozart, Beethoven, Schumann, Mendelssohn symphonies, it only takes one timpanist out of 100. Now compare that to string players. String players, by that we mean violinists, violists, cellos, basses. How many of those do you have in an orchestra? Well, you have about 70% of your orchestra, regardless of the number in the whole group. About 70% of them are string players. So it would behoove you to select a conductor who also perhaps is a string player, so they can relate to one another. Well, what about a piano player? Here you have Daniel Barenboim. Would you hire a piano player? Yes, you would. Why? Well, because the scope of a piano encompasses that of an orchestra. In fact, it is not unusual for a conductor to sit at a piano and play an entire symphony. A conductor like Leonard Bernstein can sit at the piano and play through a whole Beethoven symphony. So, but however, back to the piano, how many piano players do you have in an orchestra? Zero. Zero. You don't need a piano player to play a Beethoven symphony, a Tchaikovsky symphony, a Schumann, a Mendelssohn, a Grieg, and so on. You might have one piano player on staff for those rare occasions when you do need a piano player, maybe something from the 20th century or 21st century. But by and large, when you go to hear an orchestra, you're not going to see a piano player. But the conductor may be, and very likely is, a piano player and or a string player. Probably not a timpanist or percussionist. Are there exceptions? Of course there are. Here's one. Simon Rattle, one of the great conductors, English conductors, and known around the world for his great conducting. Here he is conducting the Berlin Philharmonic, but he's not standing on the podium as you'd expect to see a conductor. He's actually sitting at the timpani, and he is performing the timpani solo. This particular piece they're playing is written for a timpani solo. Simon Rattle actually, although he does play piano and violin, he started his career as a timpanist. His first professional orchestra job was that of a timpanist playing timpani for an orchestra. So here you have Simon Rattle playing the timpani and conducting from the timpani in front of the Berlin Philharmonic. Okay, that is the exception. What is more common is for a conductor to be a pianist or a violinist or a string player of some sort. What is very common is what you see here in this video, Yuzha Wang, great piano player, great concert pianist, playing the piano and conducting the orchestra at the same time. And you'll see her do both in this recording. She is conducting and playing. This is very common among the top orchestras, doing things, especially by early Beethoven, Mozart, Bach, Vivaldi, things that you can conduct and play at the same time. So there you have a conductor conducting from the piano and conducting the orchestra and playing the piano at the same time. Well, let's look again back at this balance between the musical responsibilities and the non-musical, and we're going to add the bonus to that side too. It's important that there be a balance. If you get too far into the non-musical part, then sometimes you have a charlatan, a faker. Now, if I were to play a video of a conductor that maybe personally I feel is kind of a charlatan, I might offend somebody in the audience. So instead, I chose this example. This is going to be Richard Dreyfuss, the actor, conducting an orchestra in one of the last scenes of the famous movie, Mr. Holland's Opus. Now, clearly, Richard Dreyfuss is not a conductor. So I kind of lump him into this category of charlatans. But he's doing his job as an actor, and doing it very well, by the way. He clearly was well trained for this role. But still, you can tell that he is not a real conductor. So what's expected of a conductor? Well, let's first watch Richard Dreyfuss, trained well, but yet he's a charlatan. Okay, so there's Mr. Holland's Opus, and yes, he's conducting, but he's not a real conductor. What is the job then, or what are the essentials that you expect to see from a conductor? Well, let's just list some of them, and many of these we're going to talk about much more detail in part 2. But the essentials of conducting are obviously you have to start everybody together. You start the orchestra, the band, the choir, you start them all together. You establish a tempo. How fast should it go? And very often you indicate a meter. That would mean, is it going in twos like a march? Ba, 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 da, ba, ba, ba. Or is it going in threes like a waltz? Da, 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 ba, 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 ba. You might indicate the dynamics. You might cue an instrument. Tell them it's time to play. Particularly if it's, say, a cymbal player who has been sitting out for the last 45 minutes and has to come in and play one big cymbal crash and then sit out for the rest of the piece. So that person, you might want to cue them. Establish a style, create a certain emotion, and of course, you want to end together. Well, let's see how many of those things we find in this particular recording. Here we have Lieutenant Colonel Fedig conducting the Marine Band, the President's Own, this is the Marine Band, conducting a performance of Stars and Stripes Forever by John Philip Sousa. Now, if anybody should know how to play Stars and Stripes, it should be the Marine Band and its conductor, Lieutenant Colonel Fedig. So here is you're seeing the definitive version of Stars and Stripes. Okay, now while that is still fresh in your mind, let's compare it to Leonard Bernstein conducting the same piece, exactly the same piece. Okay, there you have two conductors conducting two different groups, but the same piece. does the same, well, when you listen to Colonel Fettig, I said that's the definitive, that's the way it should be done. Well, Bernstein, what are the differences? What's he trying to do here? I think, first of all, he's playing in a different key. I don't know if you noticed that. The Marine Band was playing in the key of E flat, not that that matters, and the orchestra is playing in the key of D, a half step lower. Because flat keys like E flat are easier to play with a band, and sharp keys like D are easier to play with an orchestra. But the biggest difference is the one of tempo. The military approach is a very strict 120 beats per minute. Ba, 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 da, ba, 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 ba. Bernstein was going much faster than that. Ba, 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 da, ba, 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 ba. Going so fast it became frenetic. It was like he was turning it into almost a circus march rather than a military march. Very different approach. Well, before the conductor even steps on the podium, there are other things that they have to do. They have to know the ensemble. Now that means if you're working with an elementary school band or if you're working with the Boston Symphony Orchestra, you have to know your players. You have to know what they're capable of doing. What's their experience been? You also have to know the rehearsal space and particularly compare it to the performance space that's intended. So we're going to look at that in a moment, but also, how about the audience? They have to think about the audience. Are you performing this Beethoven symphony for a young, uninitiated audience, maybe an audience hearing a classical piece for the first time, or are you playing it for the Friday evening 8 o'clock concert people, those people who have heard this symphony maybe 100 times? Know your audience. You have to select the music. All conductors have to select the music, and they should study the score very thoroughly. I'd like you to listen to this next example. It's a wonderful, wonderful video to talk about what the conductor has to do before they actually get on the podium. Here you have Hendersonville High School from Tennessee, and its conductor is Elizabeth Evans. The two things to keep in mind here are, number one, the piece that she chose, Os Justi by Anton Bruckner, and secondly, the venue in which they're performing, which is the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City. Well, if you've ever seen the cathedral, it's massive. It's massive. It's like one of the top 3, 4 cathedrals in the entire world in terms of size. The size itself, it's as long as 3 football fields, if you can imagine that. And the ceiling from the floor is just hundreds of feet high. And when you add to all that the fact that it's made of mostly stone and concrete, you end up with a tremendous reverberation. Now, I'm not talking about echo, but you're talking about reverberation, that once you make a sound like a clap or any sound at all, that sound continues. It will not dissipate, in this case at the cathedral, for a full 8 seconds. So when performing in that cathedral, in that space, you have to take into consideration a reverberation time. Now listen to this conductor. This is the middle of the piece, and there's a 4-beat pause right in the middle. And you'll see in her left hand, you'll see that she cuts the choir off, and rather than just waiting 4 beats, she'll wait maybe 5 or 6 or even 7 beats, waiting for that sound to dissipate, waiting for the sound to finally fade away, so then she can continue. It's a wonderful example. I really have a great admiration for this particular conductor, knowing how to use the reverberation time in that cathedral. I guess my admiration comes from the fact that I've conducted in there several times myself, and the first time it just kind of knocked my socks off, trying to figure out what to do with this long reverberation time. She handled it very well. Next, I'd like you to look at this little clip. You might have to crank, I'm not talking to the technician now, you might have to crank the sound up a little bit on this one because it's very soft.
If you're looking for ransom, I can tell you I don't have money. But what I do have are a very particular set of skills.
Okay, I'm sorry, it has nothing to do with conducting, but I just love that little clip. Good movie. The movie is Taken, the actor is Liam Neeson. And what he's saying there is, I have a particular set of skills. Well, so do conductors. For example, oral skills. Now, what are they? Well, we're going to talk about three of them. One of them is the ability to recognize very subtle differences in pitch. Now, this is a skill that all musicians need. All musicians, when they tune up their instruments, when they tune up the clarinet, they tune the violin, they tune whatever instrument they're playing, they have to be able to recognize very subtle differences in pitch to raise or lower the instrument so it's exactly in tune. They also have to be able to sight read. Now, this needs a brief explanation too. When I say sight read, I mean when you look at a piece of music, you can actually hear in your head, in your mind's ear, what's going on the page. It's the same thing as when you pick up a book like Tale of Two Cities and you read that book. It was the best of times, the worst of times, whatever. You're looking at the words and those words make sense to you. They mean something. You can visualize in your mind, you can visualize what's happening in the story. While musicians can do the same thing, conductors have to be very good at sight reading. But the conductor then takes it one step further. Not only are they sight reading one line, but they're sight reading or reading an entire score, and we're going to look at one of those for a minute. But first, let's take a look at this problem of recognizing subtle differences in pitch. Subtle differences in pitch. Here's what I'd like to do. I'm going to ask you a simple question. What color is that? What do you see there? And you probably say, it's blue. And you'd be right, okay? If that's blue, then what is this one? Well, you say, that's still blue. Just the square got a little bit bigger, but it's still blue. Well, how about the third one? Still blue. Okay, it's still a blue square, it just got bigger. Well, you'd actually be wrong because they're not all the same shade of blue. What you were just looking at was this series of blues. They're all blue, but different shades of blue. And maybe even side by side like that, it's difficult to see the differences. What if we were to pile them up on top of each other? I think there you can see. It's kind of like going into a paint store. Remember when you go to a paint store and you ask for off-white or white? And, well, they say, do you want bone white or do you want off-white or do you want antique white? There are so many different kinds of whites. So you take these little paint chips and you line them up and you lay them one on top of the other until you find the shade of white that you're looking for. Musicians have to do the same thing. Conductors have to be able to hear these very subtle changes in pitch. Now, if you can look at this, for example. Can I have the camera over here? So here we have the pitch A, and that pitch on the piano is vibrating 440 times per second. We have down here 440 hertz. By hertz, it simply means vibrations per second. How fast is that key vibrating? And it doesn't matter whether it's a clarinet reed, or it's a vocal cord, or if it's a piano string or a violin string. If they're trying to play that note, then they have to get their instrument to vibrate 440 times per second. Now, right next door to it, this black key, right next door, is the note we call B flat. And that note vibrates at 466 hertz, or 466 times per second. All right, so we have 440 and 466. But what about the notes in between, the notes in that crack there? How many different pitches are there between A and B flat? Or how many different numbers are there between 440 and 466? Well, again, if you remember from your junior high school or elementary school geometry class, there's an infinite number of pitches in there, just as there are an infinite number of dots on a straight line. So let's just listen to one. Well, we're going to, one of these notes. So we're going to listen to 453 in a moment. But let's begin with 440. This may be a little bit loud, but just hang on. You might want to cover your ears a little bit. But here's 440, what it sounds like for about 5 seconds. Right next door, here's B flat. So there's 440 and 466. A big difference in the physical world. Here's the one right down the middle, 453. Well, you might say, well, that 453 sounded just like 440 coming off of 466. Well, if I went from 440 to 453, you might say, well, that sounds like B flat. Well, let's do it this way. Let's play 440 and 453. That's the crack in the middle. Play them simultaneously. And you'll be able to, just like taking the paint chips and lining them up where you can see the very subtle differences in color, here you'll be able to hear the very subtle difference in pitch, not so subtle really, but you're going to hear a wobble. It's going to go, yeah, 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 yeah. That wobble is because the sound making 440 and the sound making 453, they're going to clash. And every time those vibrations clash, every time those molecules bump into each other, you're going to hear a wobble. Here's what it sounds like. Do you hear that wobble? Okay, this is the kind of thing that a conductor has to be able to recognize so immediately, so quickly, as do the other musicians in the orchestra. But it's really ultimately it's the buck stops here. Ultimately, it's the conductor that has to hear any subtle changes in pitch that should not be there. Okay, how about sight reading? I'll be quiet for a moment so you can concentrate on this melody that I've written out for you. And those of you who can sight read, see if you can name that tune. I promise you it's a tune that most everybody in the audience has heard before. So here you go. You try to sight read it. Okay, anybody have an idea yet? If you guessed Tchaikovsky, you're right. And if you guessed Tchaikovsky's Romeo and Juliet, you're also right. That's exactly what it is. This is the love theme from his overture, Romeo and Juliet. Many of you may have heard it on television as maybe a deodorant commercial or a tire commercial or something else. You know, that scene where he's running across the field and she's running across the field in the opposite direction, and they meet in the middle, and you hear this melody. All right, moving on. Now, what about following the score? You're just trying to sight read or trying to hear in your head. Very often we use the word audiate or audiation, means to hear a melody in your mind's ear. Well, a conductor has to not only do that with one line, but in this case, 17 lines running simultaneously. At the very top of the page here, you have the piccolo part, and then the flute part, and then the oboe, clarinet, bassoon, and so on, right through the brass, through the strings. So those are all the parts of the orchestra running simultaneously. And the conductor has to be able to hear those vertical arrangements of notes at one moment and be able to identify the errors, the good qualities, the bad qualities, whatever. I'm going to try to lead you through this with my little laser pointer here. See that laser pointer down there? We're going to follow the violin line, which goes along like that, onto the next page, and I'm even going to turn the page for you and continue. We're going to stay with the violin part, because that's mostly where the melody is until the very end. But this is what a conductor has to do. Keep in mind that you're just following one part, whereas the conductor has to follow all the parts when reading a full score. Okay, that's what the conductor has to do. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the myths of conducting, myths versus reality. And we'll just mention three. One myth is the conductor knows more than the musicians do. Well, is that a myth or is that reality? It could go either way. It depends on the conductor, it depends on the orchestra. For example, suppose you have a conductor in which the oboe, the principal oboe player, might have 30 years experience, and maybe they're going to play Beethoven's Fifth Symphony that this conductor has played, this oboe player maybe has played 100 times, but the conductor might be a 22-year-old conductor conducting it for the very first time. So it's hard to say. And how about this? Is this myth or reality? An experienced orchestra doesn't need a conductor. Well, again, it depends on the orchestra, it depends on the conductor, but also, and more importantly, it depends on the piece they're playing. If it's something from early repertoire, like a Baroque piece or a classical piece from the 1600s, 1700s, then maybe they can get by without a conductor. But you get into the 1800s and the 1900s and the 21st century, you definitely, for most pieces, you definitely need a conductor. How about this myth? Is it myth or reality? Conductors are paid too much. All right, we're going to take each one at a time. Here we have the question again, does the conductor know more than the musicians do? And again, I don't want to offend any conductors out there or offend any people that are fans of particular conductors, so I'm going to use Richard Dreyfuss again. This is Richard Dreyfuss, a younger Richard Dreyfuss, not from Mr. Holland's opus, but rather from an earlier film that he did called The Competition. And in this film, he plays the part of a young piano player hoping to win a competition, a piano competition, and thus shoot his career off with a bang. And so he's getting rather frustrated in this scene, and you'll see that he, as the piano player, disagrees with the conductor. Now, I should also point out that in this particular movie, Richard Dreyfuss, again, is very well prepared. I think this is one of the best fake jobs I've ever seen in a movie. So often in movies, you see someone playing the violin or the trombone or whatever, and it's just a terrible job. They should have spent a few extra dollars and trained the actor how to play properly. In this movie, Richard Dreyfuss was trained very well on how to look like a piano player. So, but look primarily now at the conflict between the pianist, Richard Dreyfuss, and the conductor.
All right. There doesn't seem to be anything tricky until about bar 310. Let's take it from 3 bars
Excuse me.
before...
I'm sorry. Could we have a review of the transition into the rondo?
Oh, we take that from you, Mr. Dietrich.
I understand, but it seems to me that when the strings were answering me that you were slowing down there. Are you indicating a sostenuto there?
Da-da-dum, da-da-dum, da-da-dum.
That's what I thought.
And what else do you think, Mr. Dietrich?
I think that that is the wrong approach for this ensemble.
Now, what I like especially about this scene, of course you're going to have conflicts of interest and conflicts between a conductor and a musician in terms of how things are supposed to go. the tempo, the dynamics, whatever. But I especially like looking at the orchestra member, one of the string players there, when they start to conflict with one another, the conductor and the pianist, he covers his face and said, "Oh no, keep your mouth shut," if you want to get through this. But so conflicts of interest do occur between musicians and conductors. Now, what about the question about do orchestras actually need a conductor? Well, are we saying then that a conductor is something that is no longer needed, like the pin boy in a bowling alley, or like the milkman? Remember the milkman? I do, but we don't need him anymore, do we? So does an orchestra need a conductor, an experienced orchestra? Here I'd like you to listen to an orchestra from Europe called Spira Mirabilis. It's an orchestra that the unusual thing about it is that it deliberately does not use a conductor. They have no conductor when they perform, nor do they have a conductor when they rehearse. We have one in New York City like that too. It's called the Orpheus Orchestra. But watch this group rehearse. This is a rehearsal with Spira Mirabilis rehearsing a bit of a Schumann symphony. And listen as they'll play, and you'll see no conductor, but then you'll hear a discussion about how certain passages should go. And to compound the problem, they don't all speak the same language. Their native tongues are not the same. So they have to translate. And so very often they'll end up singing the part in order to get their point across.
Accent on the resolution. We finish forte by yari ram, but nari bam. This is not, never ever. Yeah.
I think that after the forzando it is going down. Ping, pong, pong, ping, ping.
Yeah, not too much, but yes, I mean pam 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 wah. Let's think the slur not aggressive. Pam pam wari ram. Yeah.
But it should be a little. It's the end of it, but it sounds now too cut.
That's fascinating, isn't it? All kinds of problems there with language and culture, and but no conductor, and they will work out their differences, and by the time they get to the performance, they'll have what they all agree on as the way the piece should be played. Now, what about the third and final myth-reality conflict? Are conductors paid too much? Well, let's look at a couple of them. Here you have Gustavo Dudamel. Gustavo Dudamel has been the conductor of the LA Philharmonic for about 10 years now. His salary is around $3 million a year. We'd say, yeah, that's pretty good money, $3 million a year. Yannick, the conductor of the Philadelphia Orchestra, makes about 1.5, maybe $2 million a year, but he's also conductor of the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra, where he might make another 1.5 million or 2 million, whatever. So conductors at the top of the game, we're talking about the highest paid conductors in the world, they are doing quite well. But let's make a comparison here. How about David Price, great pitcher? Yeah, he's at the top of his field, top of his game. What does he make? He has a salary of about $30 million a year. 30 million compared to 3 million. Well, let's go one step further. How about this fella? He is the CEO of Google. His annual salary is closer to 280 million a year. So the bottom line is, conductors, like anybody else, they're going to get paid whatever the market will bear. If the orchestra can afford to pay Dudamel $3 million, they will. If they could afford to pay more, they would. Now, of course, these days, again, I remind you, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and orchestras are cutting back drastically. So there's no way Dudamel or anybody in the orchestra is getting paid their full salary these days. But we hope that'll change soon. So, again, the answer is, conductors are paid too much? Well, they are paid whatever the market will bear. To finish up my talk today, I'd like to have you think about some things, characteristics, responsibilities, job descriptors, whatever you want to call them, that are hard to label. Things that are hard to label with a price tag or a degree or a title or years of experience. For example, A conductor needs to be the best musician they can be. You can tell right away if a conductor is not a musician. When you're playing in an orchestra or a band or singing in a choir, you can tell the charlatans, the fakers. So the conductor must be the best musician they can possibly be. A conductor also must listen to lots of music. And here you're talking about any conductor. Whether you're talking about the Philadelphia Orchestra with Yannick, or if you're talking about an elementary school band director, high school choir director, they all have to listen to lots of music to make sure when they select the music, it's the right music for their musicians and for their audience and for their purpose. Certainly, at the top of the pile is you have to love working with people. A conductor must have a love of working with people. Sometimes it's hard to say with people like back in the old days, if you remember the conductor Toscanini, he was a tyrant. Riccardo Muti, more recently, is famous for being losing his temper, just being, everybody's afraid of him. But generally speaking, these days, you have to have a love of working with people in order to be a successful conductor. Finally, I would say a conductor must be a teacher. Again, regardless of the level. Obviously, if you're working with a high school choir, a high school band, orchestra, obviously your primary job is to teach. But even at the professional level, you're still teaching because the conductor has a specific concept of how the music should go. And you have to teach that to the musicians, and not only teach it, but convince them that your way is the correct way to do it, at least for this one performance. I'd like to finish up where we started. We started with this young lady, and frankly, I always struggle with her name. So I found this little clip where she actually pronounces her name for us. She's Lithuanian, and we'll talk about her in a moment. But here she is trying to explain how to say her name.
The pronunciation of my name, Mirga Gražinytė Tyla.
All right, so what I get out of that is Mirga, I got that part, Mirga Gražinytė Tyla. I hope I'm close, and to all you Lithuanians out there and Mirga fans, I hope I didn't insult anybody. But what about her background? Let's run her right through the same checklist that we did with Leonard Bernstein. Did she start with lessons at an early age? Absolutely. And in her case, unlike Leonard Bernstein, she was born into a very musical family. Her father was a conductor, her mother a pianist and a singer. She started her career as a choral conductor. Why? Because when she went to the conservatory in Europe, the university, that was the only option open to her at the time. There was not an option to conduct instrumentally. The only option they had that was offered to her was to conduct a choral group. So she started out as a choral conductor, eventually changed into instrumental, and that's where she is today. Competitions, yes. At the age of 26, she won a very fine world conducting competition that kick-started her career. She went on further instruction, going to summer workshops and working privately with other conductors, picking up small jobs along the way, eventually winding up in Los Angeles as the assistant conductor to none other than Gustavo Dudamel and the Los Angeles Philharmonic. So she's been there for a few years, but then very recently, right before the pandemic hit, she was assigned finally one of the top jobs in the business, and that being the principal conductor, music director for the City of Birmingham Symphony Orchestra. She also has a very lucrative recording contract with Deutsche Grammophon, and through Deutsche Grammophon, she won Album of the Year for classical recordings. So she's at the top of her field. So this is Mirga, I'll try it one more time, Mirga Gražinytė Tyla. And here she is, right back where we started, in the beginning of our talk, conducting an excerpt from Beethoven's Leonore Overture No. 3. And I hope you'll be able to watch her with some different eyes, watch her conduct, and keep in mind all the things that had to go into her standing up in front of the orchestra on the podium in a performance. Here she goes. All right, so now we finally have our conductors on the podium. Well, what then? What happens then when they're on the podium? How do they do what they do? Well, this is going to be our topic for our next talk, Wave the Stick Until the Music Stops, Part 2, coming in December. And again, I remind you, if you have any questions, suggestions, or comments, please email me, davisgierch@hotmail.com. Both my email address and my phone number are in the Willow Valley directory on the intranet. You can find me there. But in the meantime, please stay safe, stay well, and I hope to see you next month for Wave the Stick Until the Music Stops, Part 2. Bye-bye. Have a good day.